We're continuing our series looking at well-being, and we come to our topic today on financial well-being. And one day this week, Nathan and I popped down to the barbers. We've kind of become a thing we do together, and after going to the barbers, we'll often go and get some sweets from the shop. So it was no surprise at all to me when we're walking out the barbers and Nathan was like, "Dad, can we go get some sweets?" I was like, oh, because I love him, you know, he's my son, I like him. We went and got him some sweets, and I paid for them. Obviously, he's just turned 6, he doesn't have that kind of capability, he doesn't even really understand you have to pay for things properly yet, I don't think. So anyway, we're on the way home, he's munching away on this little packet of Smarties he's got, and I'm like, Nathan, did Daddy have one? And he's instantly like, no Daddy, they're mine. I'm like, okay, and my internal response, obviously I didn't actually do this, but my internal response was like, look mate, suddenly it's turned from my son to mate, look mate, I bought them, and quite frankly I could snatch them back off you right now because I'm a lot bigger than you. Obviously I didn't do that to my son, I love him, I repeat that, but that was like the internal process going on in my mind at this moment, and it actually, later on, it made me think about something I've been reading in a book on handling money wisely, earlier that day, that makes the point that that kind of moment and how I was treated in that moment is sometimes, without care, how we actually treat God. We can, without care, as I looked at Nathan kind of with Smarties smeared across his face, enjoying them, making the most of it, we can do a similar thing. We can treat God like that. We can so often take the wonderful things that God's given us, set about enjoying them, and give really very little thought at all to the one who ultimately, in the ultimate sense, owns all of it. Ultimately, God owns all the Smarties, if you like. And so, this morning, as we continue to look at well-being, our starting point for financial well-being has to really be, as followers of Jesus, simply acknowledging that ultimately it's all His anyway. I think that's probably the only kind of starting point for looking at finance and money from a kind of a biblical point of view as those of us who are seeking to follow Jesus. Finance is hugely important as well. Looking, just taking a step back for a moment and thinking in terms of our society as a whole, apparently up to 77% of UK residents would describe themselves as being stressed about money at the point they were surveyed in this huge survey that was done a while back. And the same survey, perhaps even more worryingly, found that 38% of those that they surveyed didn't feel comfortable to talk about their money struggles, which is perhaps even more concerning than the first statistic. And I just want to acknowledge up front that there might be some here today who you yourselves are struggling with money, perhaps even struggling to repay debt, and hopefully you'll find what I share today helpful. But if you're in that kind of position, you might need far more help than just listening to some of the advice I have to give through the Bible today. And I just encourage you, don't suffer in silence. Don't be one of that 38% who are not willing to do something about it. Look up organisations like Christians Against Poverty who do incredible work in supporting people to get out of debt. I've been emailing, in fact, even this week, a former client of the debt centre that we helped to run in our previous church in Oxford, and he was just celebrating with me that he got a new job, and he was someone who stayed silent for years on his struggles, and they just ballooned out of all proportion. And just to say as well, if you're in a position of needing help, seek it. Speak to us if you want advice and input on where you can go to seek help. There won't be judgment there in any way. But just to say as well, aside from perhaps if you personally in that position, I think it's worth all of us being aware that there are probably, well not probably, there are definitely people you know in your life around you struggling financially right now, whether you're aware of it or not, and it's likely to be people that you don't expect to be struggling financially. Many of the people who come through and come and get help from CAP, for example, have stable jobs, potentially earning quite a lot of money. It's not always the people you might think might be struggling financially. So I just want to put that out there. You are probably working with people, studying with people who are in financial difficulty and you don't even realise it. So it's just worth being aware of that. There might be people around us we could be supporting and helping. And while we aren't great at speaking about money, probably not great at it in the church in general as well, not just in wider society, the Bible speaks about money an awful lot. So 16 or 38 parables are about handling money or possessions, so nearly half of them. And Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the Gospels, if you look at the Gospels, an incredible 1 in 10 verses has something to do with money. So by my very simple maths, this is actually our 10th ever in-person meeting today, so we're getting the ratio about right. But don't hold me to that. I doubt that we'll speak about money every 1 in 10 talks as a religious rule going forward, but for now we're getting it about right. So our focus today is more than just money in general, it's about how we live with a sense of financial well-being. Having that kind of sense of feeling like we're in a place where we can handle money well, where we can steward money well, rather than living with constant fear and anxiety around money. So let's dig into the Bible, because I think I've said quite enough without actually directly quoting the Bible already. So 1 Timothy 6, 6 to 10, and this is going to be like our main launching point for all that I want to say today, really, although we'll reference a few other places as well. So this is Paul writing to Timothy, a younger leader, so an older leader, writing wise advice for a younger leader. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. We could add there, for it's all God's anyway. But if we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So quite a challenging passage. I just hope really to pull some hopefully quite practical wisdom for us in how we can live with a sense of overall financial well-being. There's so much that we could cover today, but hopefully what I offer up will be helpful to you. So first of all, cultivating contentment. Contentment is an emotional state of happiness and satisfaction. Contentment is something that's far broader than just to do with money, obviously, and having contentment in our lives in a general sense is obviously going to be something that helps our overall sense of well-being. And we're told here that godliness with contentment is great gain. It's obviously highly beneficial to us. You know, the challenge of this passage, I find really challenging when thinking about contentment, is it actually defines for us what contentment around finance and possessions look like. And for us in our context here in the Western world, that's pretty hard hitting. If we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. That's pretty hard level to take, living in the settings that we live in. If we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. So Paul's basically arguing that for the believer, we should be able to be content even if that's all we have. Because I guess ultimately Jesus is all that we really need. I remember a few years back being in Macedonia, visiting and supporting a church that was part of our wider group of churches, the Catalyst Network out there. And I went to do some teaching and to look about possibly taking some of our students out to visit this church at some point in the future. So I was teaching in their Bible school, preaching in their church on a Sunday, and I was there for a week or so doing that kind of thing. And so I thought I was going to do that, but really I learned far more than I think I offered up to them. And one of the things that I learned most of all was just the humbling nature of visiting homes of people who clearly didn't have much. Like probably to an extent that's greater than most of what you'd find in our nation. And coming to the homes of people who were clearly living in terrible poverty and being shown, first of all, incredible hospitality. I'm finding that really hard to know the right way to respond, to not be offensive, but at the same time not wanting to draw away from them the little resources they had. And secondly, just how grateful in general they were for all that they had. Like almost every other sentence was something expressing gratitude for what God had given them, even though they had so little. So I think there's a lot for us to learn, actually, from Christians all around the world who live in much more difficult circumstances about what contentment really looks like. And I think one of the keys, there's so much more we could unpick, But one of the keys that I want to offer up this morning is simply learning to be grateful and thankful for all that we have. Thankfulness in all circumstances. And I would suggest that's the place for each of us to start if we ever begin to feel that we're lacking a sense of contentment, particularly around our possessions or finances. To come to God and express our gratefulness for everything that we do have. And this teaching around contentment, it needs to be balanced in that being content doesn't look like being lazy. The Bible has things to say about that as well. It doesn't look like being careless with what we already have. The Bible has a lot to say about that. So, cultivating contentment, but I also want to talk about being a good steward. Knowing we're stewards, not owners, because ultimately it's all God's anyway, actually brings incredible freedom and much relief from anxiety in the first place. Just acknowledging that we're just stewards of it, we're just managing what we have during our time here, rather than owners of it, brings a release from anxiety anyway. Not a freedom to be careless, but a freedom that gives us a foundation to manage and steward our money really well. So borrowing an illustration from the Wellbeing book that we've been basing this series on, as an aside, actually, I know some people have worked through this while we've been doing the series, but if you haven't done that, another suggestion is it might be something you want to read over the summer and go over. It's just really, really, really helpful. Generally, its advice is just brilliant, and it's just such a well-rounded look at well-being rather than just zooming in on one area. So I've actually got probably a couple of copies spare if anyone wants one, just let me know. So borrowing an illustration from that book, can you imagine driving down the road with a ditch on each side? I imagine roads near where Jude's parents live on Somerset Levels. If you get it wrong there, you really do end up in a ditch that you're probably not coming out of again, or at least your car's not coming out in any kind of good state again. And so the ditch on one side represents a poverty perspective, and the ditch on the other side represents a materialistic mindset. And then imagine the road down the middle is kind of God's plan of what financial well-being looks like for you. So in the poverty perspective, we can end up living with a fear of not having enough. But a consistent theme of the Bible is that God provides for his people. For any who choose to follow Jesus, God becomes a loving Father, which we sung about lots this morning. A Father who wants to provide for our basic needs. Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, to not worry about what we'll eat or drink or wear, because our Father knows what we need. Father knows what we need. But then the other extreme is a materialistic mindset, where we become excessively concerned with physical comfort or amassing greater and greater wealth or possession. And I think this passage speaks quite clearly to that. So we read earlier, those who want to get rich fall into temptation, fall into a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction, and have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And I just want to put out the challenge that there is the general challenge that's quite hard-hitting challenge that the passage brings. And I have seen that happen in people's lives. People literally wander from the faith, and they might not actually explicitly say it's because of money. But when it comes down to it, you can see that really a pursuit of more and more possessions has led them away from God. But I want to suggest that there's perhaps a more subtle danger hidden within this as well, which is the pursuit of personal comfort. And I think that's probably the greatest challenge to many in our generation, is making it like Jesus said, come and follow me and I'll give you all the comfort you need. And we can put all our resources towards maybe not the quite so obvious thing that doesn't work very well, of acquiring more and more wealth, but put all our resources towards making our life as comfortable, as easy, as nice as possible. Which is not what Jesus has called us to at all. So, money itself is not evil, it's a neutral thing that can be used for both good and bad, and I just want to flag up that some of that bad might be much more subtle than we realise. But when we're living from a place of contentment, going back to the previous point, we're able to use money to serve God's purposes in our lives rather than ending up letting money rule us. Going down that middle road looks like stewarding money well. And like I mentioned earlier, there's loads of parables about money, and a lot of them really are to do with stewarding money well. So the most famous one would be the parable of the talents. I'm not going to unpack it now for the sake of time, but a man entrusts his servants with money and expects them to invest it well. So there's a challenge around how we use our resources, investing them well. And I just want to really for a moment unpack 3 very practical tips on stewarding or managing our money well. Some of this will probably seem quite simple, but I guess from the amount of time I've been involved in pastoring now, I've had so many conversations over the years that will be to do with one of these 3 things not really having been lived out in people's lives, having really negative consequences ultimately on financial well-being. So, number 1, obvious like I say, but spend carefully. Crucial really to financial well-being is to be able to live with some kind of a margin in our lives. And by a margin I mean living within our means a little bit, not spending every penny we've got, and certainly not spending more than we have, so that we're left with a little bit of a margin. And I think it's possible to do that most of the time when we have small or little. I'll acknowledge there are some circumstances where it just makes it impossible to have a margin, and it's really tough if you're genuinely in that kind of position. But for most of us, most of the time, it's possible, whether we have small amounts of resources or a lot of resources, to live with some kind of a margin. It really goes back to the contentment thing again, because if we're content with what we have, it's much easier to set ourselves up so that we're living with some kind of a margin. Having a margin then allows us to do 2 more things. Firstly, save wisely. I'm not going to say loads on that, but there are actually numbers of verses, particularly in Proverbs, that promote the idea of saving. Not fear-based hoarding, but saving up money for both short-term emergencies and longer-term opportunities is a wise thing to do. And also, the saving connects to the final one around giving generously. So giving generously might be something as well, that there might be times when we use some of our savings to give away because an opportunity arises to do that. But you can't do that if you've not saved wisely. So giving generously, like I said, this talk is about our all-round financial well-being. However, I think it's impossible to talk about that without talking about giving. For a start, even before we look at the Bible on it, research has shown that being generous helps contribute to our overall sense of financial well-being. It's like there's actually quite a lot of studies out there that have found that people who are more generous tend to be happier and healthier. Jesus was way ahead of his time. He didn't bother doing any research. He just said it's more blessed to give than receive, didn't he? Like, he didn't bother to do all the studies, he just knew it to be true. And Terry Virgo, a former church leader and founder of the New Frontiers movement of churches that the Catalyst Network we're part of grew out of, he says this about giving, starting to bring it into the church context. I was writing something like this myself and we realised he said it way better, so I'm just going to quote him. Jesus said, "Give and it will be given to you." That's in Luke 6:38. Our immediate reaction is, that's crazy, it can't possibly work. But it does. Many Christians have proved it. Some of them have very little to start with, but they've given to God's work and He's rewarded them in that. Their motivation isn't the rewards, nor do they think the church leader expects me to give, so I better obey, and I don't want anyone thinking that here. They simply recall how much Jesus gave for them and want to give all they can to Him. And for Jean and I would say that we found these principles to be true again and again. I'm reluctant to always tell specific stories around that area, because I think the Bible has something to say about something to do with your left hand, not what your right hand's doing, these kind of things. So I'm reluctant to tell specific stories, but we've just discovered again and again this whole principle of give and it will be given to you. And just the joy as well of just choosing to be faithful with giving, even when we've had very little to give, and watching how God's blessed us in our lives as a result. There's incredible biblical principles around this. And the reality is that even if we've given and not experienced any kind of blessing, we'd still have every reason to be grateful and thankful to God, because really He's given us everything we need in Jesus, and if we have food and clothing, we should be content. So the model of the New Testament, I realise I'm saying more about giving here, but I I was just aware when preparing this, I think you can't start down the route of talking about giving without unpacking it reasonably thoroughly. So the model of the New Testament giving, to get really practical, is simply generosity. Sometimes people will talk about the idea of tithing, which is the idea of giving 10% of one's income, which is found in the Old Testament. And that can be a good guide, but actually if you delve into it in the Old Testament, actually they were giving more like 30% anyway. So just like, there's actually more to look into there than sometimes put across. It can be a good guide of how much we should give to the work of the church, but tithing our income, it can be a great starting point, but it's not really the model of the New Testament. The model of the New Testament is giving generously. The idea of giving regularly and proportionally also comes across in the kind of teaching of the New Testament. But care is really needed, because something the New Testament is really clear on is it should be done from a cheerful and a joyful heart, and not under any sense of compulsion or feeling like you're being forced. So the New Testament model is simply generosity. It's simply seeking God and giving what you decide in your heart is right to give. So for us at Emmanuel, and I'm speaking now particularly for anyone who consider this to be their home church, our simple encouragement is, if you're already giving regularly, well, thank you very much for getting involved in the giving life of the church. Like, this church is already being hugely funded and aided by all the people who are giving month in, month out, and we're just really grateful for that. And if you're in that position, just keep praying about what God wants you to give. Don't feel like, because you've just been given a certain amount, you don't always have to give that going forward. Keep seeking God as to what He wants you to give. He might ask you to give more. There might be times when your income reduces and you need to consider giving less, and that's absolutely fine. And if you aren't giving, all we ask is that you prayerfully consider whether it's right for you to get involved in the giving life of the church. Quite simply because we never want to overstep the New Testament's model of giving, which is generously, by considering it in our hearts and giving kind of out of a cheerful heart, not out of any sense of compulsion or force. So hopefully from September, without COVID restrictions, we'll be able to give far more options of how people can give on Sundays as well, because the only option we're really giving for at the moment is online giving. And if you want to know any more about Emmanuel's finance as well, we're always happy to answer any questions on it. And as we enter the next year, we're going to plan on having several points where we're just really open about where things are at financially. We haven't really done that so far because there hasn't really been that much to unpack during the COVID time. So I realise we said quite a lot about giving just there. It's not particularly my intention, because I wanted to speak about money today, or I wanted to speak about giving. In particular, it's just, I think it is really a key part of our financial well-being. And the bigger point I wanted to make is how crucial that principle is: give and it will be given to you. So we've looked at, in these kind of 3 practical points, spending carefully, saving wisely, and giving generously. Finally, by way of conclusion, I just really want to take us back to thinking about how it's all God's anyway, and add in the power of prayer across all these areas that we've talked about. Throughout this series, we've followed the story of Elijah, and there's a story towards the end of Elijah's time on earth where he appoints Elisha as a successor. It's always a real tripping point for me when you get both Elisha and Elijah in the same point. So he appoints Elisha as a successor, and there's a slightly strange account of Elisha says bye to his parents, basically burns all his farming equipment, and then basically hosts a barbecue with all the animals that he had to pull his farming equipment. And you're like, what's all that about? And essentially, he was burning all his bridges, and it was like this moment of total surrender to God. By destroying the means of farming the land, he was kind of giving himself no way back and totally committing to the new route that God was calling him, totally committing to following Elijah in his case. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we all need to go home and burn our laptops or whatever equipment our work gives us. God's probably not calling you to do that, just to be really clear. But ultimately, financial well-being comes from a sense of surrendering all that we have over to Jesus. It's not really just about surrendering our finances, it's about the surrender of our whole lives to Him and giving Him our everything. And finance is just a component of that contributes to our overall sense of well-being. God is a good Father who knows what we need, and God is also He loves to guide us and lead us. He gives us the gift of the Holy Spirit. And kind of thinking through all that we've covered today, I'd like to have done a whole other point on prayer. I realised I was prepping it, I just wouldn't have time to cover that, because I think prayer and finance are really significant as well. So instead of doing a whole other point, I'm just going to do a couple of lines on it. Thanking God for all that He's given us to cultivate contentment. It's a really important area of prayer when it comes to finance. Praying through those practical areas, what we spend, what we save, what we give away. Massively important to seek God on, and I believe God loves to input and direct on those things. If you're married, praying through those things together. If you're not, just bringing them before Jesus on your own, or if you're struggling to do that, get the help of a trusted friend and pray through it together like that. Also, just asking God, a whole other area we've not really covered and I'd love to, would just be asking God when we're in need of provision. Because we have a Father who loves to provide, and who loves it when we come to Him and say, Father, I need this. Lord God, please come through on this for us. So we're going to do that right now as we wrap up. We're just going to pray.